So, welcome everybody to the first of three Lunch with Luther presentations. This year we are taking up something that took place 501 years ago. Luther returning from the Wartburg to Wittenberg, the town where he was a professor, where he pretty much lived from his early 30s until his death, serving there as a professor of theology and was the city church's preacher. But we're going to take up a very significant event in his life and career as a reformer, the preaching of a series of sermons known as the Invocavit Sermons. And we'll unpack some of that today. But on the morning of Sunday, March 9th, 1522, after an 11-month exile in the Wartburg Castle, a cowled and tonsured Martin Luther mounted the pulpit of the town church in Wittenberg to speak to an audience that had not seen him in a very long time. With a voice an audience member later described as pleasant and sonorous, Luther began his homily. The summons of death comes to us all, and no one can die for another. All must fight their own battle with death by themselves alone. We can shout into one another's ears, but everyone must individually be prepared for the time of death. For I will not be with you then, nor you with me. Therefore, each person must personally know and be armed with the chief things that concern a Christian. And these are what you, my beloved, heard from me many times in the past. In the rest of the sermon and over the course of 7 more, delivered on consecutive days of the next week, Luther held forth on these chief things, which he identified as the knowledge of sin, faith in Christ, love of neighbor, and patience with the weak. Those were of first importance and fundamental to everything else a Christian did or said. Subordinate to these things were various issues that Luther felt compelled to address, including policies concerning the Mass, clerical vows, images, the eating of meat, the sacrament, and confession. Luther himself viewed the Reformation that he championed as a matter of reforming pastoral care. It was, I think, 6 Lunch with Luther series ago where we focused on that part of the Reformation that Luther himself would have characterized his project as a reformer as that. He in a letter in 1516 said to one of his fellow monks in the Augustinian order that this is what we have been laboring for all along, for theology and the salvation of the brethren. And the scholar James Stroll, a Reformation history professor at Berkeley, she wrote a book in which she put it this way: one could describe Luther's career as the mounting of a lifelong pastoral malpractice suit against the church's authority at every level of hierarchy. And what these sermons that Luther preached that week of Invocavit in 1522 do is show us Luther at his pastoral best. He lovingly, winsomely draws the people entrusted to his care to a life centered in Christ so that they might show a love toward one another consistent with the faith that they had in the God who loved them. And these sermons, by the way, are called the Invocavit Sermons, from what is the first word in Latin of the introit for that day of the church year. So this is the first Sunday in Lent. First Sunday in Lent. And the introit begins with a verse from Psalm 91, verse 15. And in Luther's translation, it was, "He called upon me and I answered him," or I heard him. if you looked in your own Bibles today, it would be in the future tense. It would read, he will call upon me, and I will hear him. Fact check me, Bev. But that's because there's a variant manuscript where certain manuscripts have it in the past tense, other manuscripts have it in the future. So you'll, depending on what church you're attending and how they choose to, which translation they choose to go with, you'll have that first Sunday in Lent either called either the Invocavit Sunday or the Invocavit Sunday. And that one letter difference is the difference between past tense and future. Just so you know. I can't help myself. I teach Latin. So we know the chant for future tense verbs. Bo, bi, 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 ba. Right? Yeah, you do. You're educated. All right. And so the days of the week that follow Invocavit Sunday would be Invocavit Monday, Invocavit Tuesday, Invocavit Wednesday, and therefore that's why these sermons delivered that week of the first Sunday in Lent are known as the Invocavit Sermons. Today and next Wednesday and the Wednesday after, we're going to explore the characters and events that prompted these sermons, the issues at controversy, the theological insights of the sermons themselves, and the example Luther set for pastoral practice. And finally, especially in that third session, we want to explore the implications and possible application of the Invocavit sermons to some issues today in this congregation, but in the Christian church at large too. And because the Invocavit sermons have the great advantage of being short, it'll be possible for us to read all of them in the time that we have. But we'll save reading most of them for next week. Today, let's discuss the background, the various personalities, the actions they took in Luther's absence that provoked Luther to leave the safety of his fortress, the Wartburg Castle, and enter public life again. In the hands of a capable dramaturge, the period between April 1521 and March 1522 had the makings of an engrossing three-act play. We have in Act 1 the introduction of our hero, the monk and Bible professor Martin Luther, whose rediscovery of the gospel, God's free gift of forgiveness through Christ, received through faith, resonated with Christian consciences across Europe. But by the hierarchy of the medieval church, Luther's teachings were seen as heresy and a threat to their power structure. Therefore, Luther was first excommunicated by the Pope, and at the Diet of Worms, where Luther refused to recant his writings, declared a criminal by the Holy Roman Emperor. Fated to be killed, Elector Frederick the Wise, the prince of the territory in which Luther lived, had Luther kidnapped and whisked away to the Wartburg Castle in the Thuringian forest. To review these events, see the recordings of the Lunch with Luther series from 2 years ago. So ends Act 1, lower curtain. Before moving into Act 2, let's meet the dramatis personae. The first character, one who hardly needs an introduction, is Martin Luther himself. In the picture you see on that first page of the handout, you have three pictures. The first, the one in, I guess, sepia, is of Luther as a monk. This is Luther in his cowl and the tonsured hair. And so that gives you an idea of what Luther would have looked like in the pulpit when he preached the Invocavit sermons. The one below that would have been, and all of these, by the way, are painted by the great painter of the Reformation, an artist who lived in Wittenberg during Luther's years. There's Lucas Cranach. He's kind of the go-to artist of the Reformation, the go-to artist for Luther, does woodcuts for his German Bible, is responsible for any number of altar pieces, and of course, portraits of just about all the important figures of the Reformation that we know. But the one below, in the lower left of the page, would be one painted not long after the Invocavit sermons were given. So that's 1522 that Lucas Cranach did that. And we know, of course, the Invocavit Sermons were in March of 1522. So you see the same cowl that he likely wore in the pulpit, but of course the tonsure isn't there. The hair is full again. And then we'll talk about the other one on the right side in a second. Well, okay, so that one is of that's what Luther would have looked like during his Wartburg Castle days. And remember, he let his beard out so as not to be recognized and called himself Knight George, Junker George. What do we need to know about Martin Luther? He was born in Eisleben, Germany, which from Leipzig is about an hour's drive west. In November of 1483, he was educated at schools in Mansfeld, which is just west of us, right? Not far from here. But also Magdeburg and the University of Erfurt. He became a monk at the monastery in Erfurt, received his Doctor of Theology, and was transferred to Wittenberg in 1512, where he served as professor in biblical studies. It was there in 1517, of course, alarmed at the spiritual consequences of indulgent sales, that he posted his 95 Theses and published an accompanying essay that defended those theses. Soon thereafter, he found himself in the center of a political and religious storm, and the leader of a movement of reform he had really no intention of starting. Instigated by an inner crisis of conscience and pushed by a study of the Scriptures, Luther was led to a rediscovery of a God gracious to sinners, not on account of their works, but on account of Christ's life, death, and resurrection for them, a righteousness not their own, but Christ's righteousness received by faith. And so not just the sale of indulgences then, but major teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church of his day, Luther began to see as in conflict with and contradiction of this central truth. And foremost among those practices was the celebration of the Mass, or what we might call the liturgy surrounding the Lord's Supper, which the church of his day treated not as God's gift to us, but as the priest's or the church's re-sacrifice of Christ to God. And so to this and many other practices, Luther made sharp objections in sermons and lectures and academic debates and polemical essays, religious tracts and devotional writings that both cheered and enlightened and comforted many and angered many others, including not a few bishops, archbishops, popes, and princes. The verdict, of course, was reached at the Diet of Worms, about which we learned 2 years ago. And during his exile in the Wartburg, Luther, among other things, translated the New Testament into German. Learned about that last year. A marvel both theological and literary, whose legacy in raising the bar for biblical translation and in transforming Christian piety endures to this day. Person number 2. Like Paul Harvey would say, page 2.
I do remember
That was usually his way of saying there's not going to be an ad. Right?
Okay.
Page 2. But person number 2, Elector Frederick the Wise, without whom Luther would have died as a heretic on a stake in Rome, and there would have been no Lutheran Reformation. To appreciate him, we go back in time to the division of the region in eastern Germany known as Saxony. In 1485, Saxony was divided among 2 brothers. You ready for this? I am not making this up. Ernest and Albert. That's right, Bert and Ernie. And as on Sesame Street, so in history, Ernie gets the last laugh. The 2 brothers had ruled together for 20 years, but then decided for reasons unknown to history to part ways. Saxony was then cut in 2, Ernestine Saxony and Albertine Saxony. And Ernestine Saxony ends up comprising the electoral territory, the electoral circuit. That is to say, one of the 7 lands in the Holy Roman Empire whose prince had a vote in the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick was born in 1463, a descendant of Ernie. He kept track of his ancestors. We talked about that in the first Samuel class. And therefore an heir of electoral Saxony, and he became prince in 1486. As an elector, he was quite close to the emperor that preceded Leo X. We all know Leo X. The emperor, the emperor that preceded Charles V. Who is the emperor before whom Luther stands at the Diet of Worms. But he was quite close to Maximilian. That's the preceding emperor. And upon Maximilian's death, Frederick was seen as very much a potential successor. He was the favorite candidate of England, Venice, and the Pope. But he declined on account of his age and claiming that he did not have the resources in his land to support being the ruler of the empire. He was a pious prince in many ways. He attended Mass every day, even while hunting or traveling. He spent substantial amounts of his resources on sacred vessels and vestments. Perhaps most famous he was for his collection of relics. As a ruler, he was a model in prudence. One of his favorite sayings was, "One should not easily say yes, but what one promises one ought to keep." Another favorite saying was, "Nothing lies on earth as much as man." He did not tolerate dishonesty, was scrupulously honest with his money and expected his servants to be likewise. He had a reputation for generosity and fairness, and so no wonder he earned the nickname Frederick the Wise. When Saxony was divided, it meant that Leipzig, which was in the non-electoral part, ducal Saxony they called it, Bert's part, it had a university. But Ernie's part, electoral Saxony, where Frederick was, did not. And to have a university meant prestige, but it also brought with it economic advantages. Statecraft and government, which at this time was undergoing a kind of modernization and streamlining needed trained civil servants. And so a university would be just the thing for this. A university would attract the best minds from all over, whose money and work would then stay in his land. Besides, there wouldn't be a brain drain. His best wouldn't be leaving the land to go study elsewhere. And so with his own castle in Wittenberg as kind of the starting, the first building of the campus, Frederick founded the university where Luther would one day become the star professor. Frederick himself paid the salaries of all the professors. You have a kind of a law faculty, an arts faculty. He paid all their salaries except those that were professors of theology. They came from the monastery in town, which happened to be the monastery to which Luther belonged, the Augustinian one. And while he did not appoint them, that fell to a council whose members he did appoint. He did have a lot of input in the selection of professors. And as to some of these Wittenberg professors we now turn, since they play such a huge part in our play's second act. Starting with the lead rabble-rousers, Karlstadt and Zwilling, Gabriel Zwilling. So turn again, this should be still on page 2. The picture you see below that of Frederick the Wise is that of Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt. And that von Karlstadt is just saying that's the city he's from, the town of Karlstadt. And that was the name he tended to go by. That's his birthplace. He had studied in Erfurt, Cologne, and Wittenberg, and in 1510 earned the Doctor of Theology degree. He first appeared in 1516 as an opponent of Luther's, but soon became convinced of Luther's views and became at times his most vociferous supporter. Yet differences remained between them both in their tactics and in their actual positions. Karlstadt participated with Luther in a very significant debate, the Leipzig debates of 1519, a debate instigated by a guy named Johann Eck, who was a very violent opponent of Luther, a professor at Ingolstadt, which turned out to be in many ways the climax of Luther's theological development. Because it was in the course of that debate that Luther was pushed deeper into the scriptures and was brought to recognize just how empty the claim of papal supremacy was. Karlstadt, we'll soon see, in Luther's absence, is going to rush reforms at Wittenberg, preaching from the pulpit at the city church and instituting wholesale changes to worship forms, the use of images, the wearing of vestments, and many other things which caused much unrest and eventually displeased not only Luther, but other reformers and leaders, including Frederick the Wise himself. Alongside Karlstadt in this so-called Wittenberg movement, that's what they're calling what's the events happening in Wittenberg while Luther's in the Wartburg, another fellow by the name of Gabriel, I couldn't find a picture of him.
Zwingli.
No, not Zwingli. Different guy. Yeah, Zwingli's Swiss. Zwingli's in Switzerland. Gabriel Zwilling. So he's a monk and preacher at the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg. And in sermons beginning in late September, early October of 1521, Zwilling, who at this point is being hailed as a second Martin, he begins preaching against the Mass. And in a few weeks, the Augustinians, so the monks in the monastery at least, they cease celebrating the Mass altogether. By Zwilling's encouragement, the monks are also leaving the monastery. And in the ensuing months, many of them, including Zwilling and Karlstadt themselves, get married. They leave the monastery and they find wives. Then, of course, there is Luther's closest colleague at the University of Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon, page 3. Melanchthon was one of Europe's foremost scholars. He received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Heidelberg, his Master of Arts at Tübingen. He went on to issue a Greek textbook. I love little details like this. So Melanchthon's Greek primer, the textbook used to teach young people Greek, was used by Shakespeare. We know this. We know Shakespeare learned Greek from Melanchthon's textbook. It was a standard for many, many years. He was a noted leader of the humanist movement, which is to say this circle of scholars devoted to the recovery of ancient texts and restoring the best in literature. It's the humanist movement that has us go back and see where Jerome, for example, may have gotten his translation wrong, because we're now looking at the New Testament again in the original Greek, or the Old Testament in the original Hebrew. Melanchthon is recommended for his professorship at Wittenberg by his grand uncle, Johann Reuchlin. Reuchlin is himself Europe's foremost Hebrew scholar. So his recommendation makes a big difference. It means a lot to Frederick. And so he arrives in Wittenberg, Melanchthon does, in August of 1518. It's said that he often lectured to audiences of over 400 students at a time and rivaled Luther in popularity among the students. People came from far and wide to hear Melanchthon teach. He was instrumental also in constructing an educational program that would strengthen the Reformation and help ensure its future. He retooled the university's curriculum and wrote curricula for every level of education for schools throughout Europe. He was also the author, I think you would know this, that he was the author of the Augsburg Confession and its apology, the statement of belief that the Lutheran princes and theologians presented to the emperor in 1530. And it was Melanchthon, we'll see this a little bit later, that Luther wanted to preach in his place at the city church while he was in the Wartburg. But Melanchthon, although theologically qualified, was never ordained as a priest. And not for that reason. He actually thought, Melanchthon did, that if anything, this would be a good move to have someone theologically qualified but not sort of in the medieval system become priest of a place. But for other reasons, namely, he did not feel up to the task personally and much preferred teaching to preaching. And so he declined the invitation to be the preacher at the city church in Luther's absence. But it's to a large extent through Melanchthon's eyes that Luther is seeing what's going on in Wittenberg while he's away. It's through the many letters Melanchthon is sending him during those 11 months. Other important colleagues of Luther, who will both lead the reform efforts at Wittenberg and remain in close contact with Luther during this time, include Justus Jonas. Didn't give you his picture. He's the rector of the University of Wittenberg, and a guy named Nicholas von Amsdorf, one of the first students at the University of Wittenberg and one of Luther's traveling companions to Worms, as well as, and we can't not know this guy, Spalatin. Who's Spalatin? Spalatin is chaplain to Frederick the Wise. He's also Frederick the Wise's personal secretary, and so he's handling all the official correspondence for the elector. And over the course of his life, Spalatin and Luther exchange over 400 letters. They are very good friends. All right, so now our curtain rises on Act 2, Scene 1. And I kind of imagine the stage set up so that we have on this side, stage left, goings on in Wittenberg. And stage right, we have, right? Is that, let's see.
Yeah.
It's as you face. So this is left, this is right. Yeah. Stage right, we will have Luther in his room in the Wartburg, doing, among other things, translating the Bible into German. But Wittenberg, a little bit on Wittenberg. It's a town situated on an elevated site on the Elbe River's northern bank. It's more a village than a city, with dirty streets at this time and ugly, squat wooden houses, maybe about 400 of those, and a population of no more than 2,500. And as you cross the Elbe, this bridge over the Elbe into the town, facing east, you would see to your far right the castle church, on which Luther put the 95 Theses. In the center of the town would be the city church, St. Mary's, where Luther had been appointed the preacher when he first got there, and where Karlstadt would preach while Luther was in the Wartburg. And to the south, or to your left, would stand the monastery of the Augustinians. All right. Stage left, we've got or stage right, we've got the room of the Wartburg, in which Luther, we know, was quite lonely. He longed for human company, living with the birds, filling his days with such labors as writing devotional works, reading and answering letters, writing a series of sermons that would serve as examples for the growing number of evangelical priests, and of course the translation of the Bible. When you think about it, Luther's absence from Wittenberg doesn't begin with his time in the Wartburg. It begins a few months before that, when he first left for Worms, which was really early April of 1521. And I have given you a chronology on the next page. I think it's the next page, of specific events that lead up to Luther's return. And so this is for you if you just want to review, but you certainly are going to get the sense of this accelerated pace of the reforms that the Wittenbergers are instituting, especially when you move into December and January. But at that time, when Luther left, already in motion were plans to abandon private masses. Do we know what we mean by that? That's a celebration of the Lord's Supper that were conducted only by the priest. There are no communicants. These private masses, and they were often done for the sake of the dead. You still can have these done. You can pay to have a mass said. It was a very effective fundraising tool. You charge to have people have masses prayed for the dead in exchange for a gift to the church. When Luther went to Rome as a representative of the monastery, among the many disquieting things he witnessed were priests praying the Mass at so fast a pace the words were unintelligible. And there was even a rule in place to prevent this, saying that a Mass had to take at least 12 minutes. And Luther said he witnessed Masses that were said in under 7. But of course, that increases the possible number of masses you can get in a day, and thereby maximizing profits. Luther also wrote at the time that he wished his parents had died by then, so that he could have bought them a mass. Yeah. So, but shucks, they're still around. Can't do you that favor. In addition, as Luther, around the time Luther leaves for Worms, vows of celibacy were seriously being questioned. Once at the Wartburg, Luther would be pressed by Karlstadt's public statements on the subject to articulate a clearer, what he would consider a clearer, more biblically sound argument. And incidentally, Luther at first was sure only of the invalidity of priestly celibacy, since that was imposed. You had to be celibate, the church said, to a priest. But what gave Luther pause was a monk's vow of celibacy, because it was done voluntarily. And so the question is, under what circumstances could a monk in good conscience renounce a vow he had undertaken freely? Karlstadt's reasoning against it just didn't satisfy. But by October, Luther will have reached a conclusion that vows of celibacy, because taken in the misguided belief that they were in fulfillment of a higher perfection that God himself did not command, could be broken. That you could choose to renounce your vow of celibacy, though voluntary, but done in the mistaken belief that somehow God commands this as a higher form of righteousness. And that being not true, therefore, a vow made with that mindset could be gotten out of. However, Luther himself is not going to say everybody has to do this. He himself, while released from his vow as a monk by his vicar general by this time, remains a monk voluntarily for 4 more years. Okay? So, but as he'll say in the work on monastic vows, man's own vow of celibacy, when it comes into conflict with God's command to love, the vow must go. The main thing was Christian liberty. A vow of celibacy is made for the sake of man, not man for the sake of a vow of celibacy. It's also at this time that introducing communion in both kinds, that is, permitting communicants and not just the priest to receive both the host and the cup at the Lord's Supper, is being attempted. And the first known case of this occurs in September and involves Melanchthon and Wittenberg students, but not, as far as we know, in a public church service. This was likely a service, maybe even at Melanchthon's house or in the cloister, but not publicly, not yet. But already that summer, so summer of 1521, Karlstadt has published a series of theses on communion that include the statement that receiving the Lord's Supper in only one kind is a sin. Luther in the Wartburg had himself resolved to end the tyranny of withholding the cup from the laity. But he objected to Karlstadt calling receiving only the bread or the body of Christ a sin, because that was to condemn the victim and not the ones responsible, the priests. Okay, keep that in mind. All this is going to play into the things we read in the sermons he preaches. In October, so October of 1521, a group of monks from Lichtenberg on the Elbe visited Wittenberg preaching and asking for alms, and they were harassed and insulted by students from the university. In that same month, because of the extent and the speed with which changes were being made, monks abandoning their vows, communion in both kinds being celebrated by the Augustinians, Elector Frederick appoints a commission of the university faculty to investigate matters. The purpose of the commission was to get these Augustinians to slow down and refrain from making all these startling changes. And in a few weeks' time, the commission came back with the request that the misuse of the Mass, the private Masses and the observance of the public Mass as a sacrifice instead of a sacrament, that be abolished as soon as possible. But they also said, we'll do it when you say we can do it, and in the meantime, we're not going to make any new innovations. Okay? It's around that time that Luther publishes Abuse of the Mass and urges that the Roman Catholic Mass be abolished, but then also cautions in that same work that changes proceed in faith and with love. You can read for yourself on the timeline other events that transpire, including Luther's decision to visit Wittenberg himself, disguised as Knight George on December 4th. And he turns out not to be that unsettled by what he finds, writing favorably about the experience in a letter shortly after his return to the Wartburg, which is very surprising given that the day before he got there, students with unsheathed swords under their coats, described as young, unrestrained, ignorant Martinians, disturbed the Mass in the city church, drove the priest from the altar, and took away the altar book, basically, the missals that the priest led the service from. And on December 4th, the very day Luther's there, students taunted monks of the Franciscan monastery on the outside of town and threatened to storm their cloister. The elector, of course, is not pleased by this and demanded that all these bad actors be punished swiftly and severely. And while Luther does seem to have minimized this in that letter I was telling you about, it is the case that the very next treatise he has published is one entitled A Sincere Admonition to All Christians to Guard Against Insurrection and Rebellion. Elector Frederick had also requested the university to submit an opinion on the question of the Mass. And this caused quite a division. You've got the traditionalist camp, members of the Castle Church Governing Board, insisting on keeping things the same. Keep the Mass just as it's been in medieval times for hundreds of years. The Reform group, headed by people such as Karlstadt and Zwilling and Melanchthon, they contended for changes on biblical ground. Things came to a head on Christmas Day when Karlstadt decided to celebrate Mass in his own way in the Castle Church. He wore no priestly vestments. The words of consecration offered in German, not Latin, and he handed each communicant the bread, body, the chalice, blood, directly into their hands. So this is shocking for two reasons. One, he's communing in both kinds, and instead of the standard procedure of placing the bread, Christ's body, directly on the tongue, he's putting it in their hands for themselves to put in the mouth. So all of this scandalous. During the Christmas midnight Mass, mobs created disturbances in all the churches of the town. And so, largely, at the instigation of Karlstadt's preaching, we have the beginnings of this iconoclastic movement, with altars and images being destroyed in the monastery church, the destruction of pictures and images and altars by townspeople later in February at the parish church. In late January, you'll see it on the timeline, the city council issues this so-called Wittenberg Ordinance, mandating reforms to the Mass and the institution of poor relief, that they're going to take some of the money that was going to the monasteries, which are now, for the most part, emptied, and use them to relieve those in need. Karlstadt, at the same time, releases two treatises he's written, one called On the Removal of Images, the other called That There Be No Beggars Among Christians. And just to anticipate the discussion later, this Wittenberg Ordinance is made up of 17 articles. And it's really only two of them that are really going to animate Luther and will show up as discussion points in the sermons. One is this, that the images and altars in the churches should be done away with in order to avoid idolatry. For 3 altars without images are enough. And then the next one goes into great detail about all the things that must happen to make the Mass acceptable again. And so we'll get to that. It says, also the communicant may take the consecrated host in the hand and himself put it in his mouth. The same may be done with the cup, hence drinking from it. But then before that, this part of the liturgy stays, this part of the liturgy goes, this part of the liturgy stays. Okay. Because of all the unrest and the radical changes being pushed, princes of the neighboring lands, from which some of the students have come, have ordered that their students come back. And so it is in February that Luther writes letters to Elector Frederick, of course through Spalatin, that the time has come for him to return to Wittenberg and deal with these matters personally. And so I brought excerpts from these letters. This is one written in February 20. Remember, he's back on maybe March 7th. And 2 days later, he's preaching the first Invocavit sermon. So he's there Friday, March 7th, and he preaches Sunday, March 9th. So February 22nd, before that March, he writes this to the elector. And see, this is in the midst of all these disturbances going on in Wittenberg. And remember, what does Frederick like to collect? Okay. So listen to what Luther does in this letter. Grace and joy from God the Father on the acquisition of a new relic. I put this greeting in place of my assurance of respect. For many years your grace has been acquiring relics in every land, but God has now heard your grace's request and has sent your grace without cost or effort a whole cross, together with nails, spears, and scourges. I say again, grace and joy from God on the acquisition of a new relic. And what's he referring to? He's calling the disturbances in Wittenberg the cross he now has to bear. And so, hey, perfect for a guy that likes relics. Your grace should not be terrified by it. Stretch out your arms confidently and let the nails go deep. Be glad and thankful, for thus it must and will be with those who desire God's word. Not only must Annas and Caiaphas rage, but Judas must be among the apostles and Satan among the children of God. Only be wise and prudent, and do not judge according to reason or outward appearances. Do not be downhearted, for things have not yet come to such a pass as Satan wishes. And see, notice also, this is an insight into how Luther is seeing things. Luther is, if anything, more concerned about the troubles being caused by his so-called allies than he is by his opponents, people like Eck and Imser and Cajetan and you name it. See, because what does he say? Not only must Annas and Caiaphas rage, well, that would be the Pope and his guys. They're the religious leaders of the institutional church. No, but Judas must be among the apostles and Satan among the children of God. That's how he's seeing these rabble-rousers back in Wittenberg. They're like the Judases. They're betraying the cause. Your grace should have a little confidence in me, fool that though I am, for I know these and other similar tricks of Satan. I do not fear him, because I know that this hurts him. Yet all of this is only a beginning. Let the world cry out and pass its judgment. Let those fall away who will, even as St. Peter, or persons like the apostles. They'll come back on the third day when Christ rises from the dead. This word in 2 Corinthians 6 must be fulfilled in us. Let us prove ourselves in tumults. I hope that your grace will take this letter in good part. I'm in such haste that my pen has had to gallop, and I have no time for more. God willing, I shall soon be there, but your grace must not assume responsibility in my behalf. So, Frederick does not like this. He does not want Luther leaving the castle. Okay? So, Frederick sends as quickly as possible a message back to Luther saying, do not go, I cannot protect you. This is very imprudent on your part. You're exposing yourself. You're still an outlaw, remember? And to get to Wittenberg, you're going to have to go through lands where I'm not in charge of you. I can't save you. So Luther writes back. This is March 5th now, 1522. Most serene, noble elector, most gracious Lord, your electoral grace's kind letter and opinion reached me Friday evening as I was preparing to depart the next day. I need not say that I know your electoral grace has the very best of intentions, for I'm as certain of it as a man can be. On the other hand, I'm convinced by more than human means of reckoning that I too have good intentions, but this doesn't get us anywhere. As for myself, most gracious Lord, I answer this. Your electoral grace knows, or if you do not, I now inform you of the fact, that I have received the gospel not from men, but from heaven only, through our Lord Jesus Christ, so that I might well be able to boast and call myself a minister and evangelist, as I shall do in the future. I offered to appear for hearings and trial, not because I had doubts about my mission, but out of excessive humility, in order to persuade others. But since I now see that my excessive humility abases the gospel, and that if I yield an inch, the devil will take a mile, I am compelled by my conscience to act otherwise. I have served your electoral grace well enough by staying in hiding for this year to please your electoral grace. The devil knows very well that I did not hide from cowardice, for he saw my heart when I entered Worms. Had I then known that as many devils were lying in wait for me as there were tiles on the roofs, I should nevertheless have leaped into their midst with joy. I have written this so your electoral grace might know that I'm going to Wittenberg under a far higher protection than the electors. I have no intention of asking your electoral grace for protection. Indeed, I think I shall protect your electoral grace more than you're able to protect me. And if I thought that your electoral grace could and would protect me, I should not go. The sword ought not and cannot help a matter of this kind. God alone must do it, and without the solicitude and cooperation of men. Consequently, he who believes the most can protect the most. And since I have the impression that your electoral grace is still quite weak in faith, I can by no means regard your electoral grace as the man to protect and save me. Since your electoral grace wishes to know what to do in this matter and thinks that you've done too little, I humbly answer that your electoral grace has already done far too much and should do nothing at all. God will not and cannot tolerate your worrying and bustling, or mine. He wishes the matter to be left in his hands and no one else's. May your electoral grace act accordingly. If your electoral grace believes, then your electoral grace will be safe and have peace. If your electoral grace does not believe, I at least do believe, and must leave your electoral grace's unbelief to its own torturing anxiety, such as all unbelievers have to suffer. Inasmuch as I do not intend to obey your electoral grace is excused before God if I'm captured or put to death. Before men, your electoral grace should act as an elector, obedient to the authorities and allowing his imperial majesty to rule in your cities and lands over both life and property, as is his right according to the imperial constitution. So that's that letter. And then shortly before, so now March 7th or 8th, 1522, this is the last thing to hear from Luther before he begins the Invocavit Sermons. It's very telling, very revealing, because he's going to tell the elector exactly why he, Luther, feels compelled to do this. He gives several reasons, and these reasons are going to show up in the sermons themselves. What should I do? There is urgent reason for my return, and God compels and calls me. Therefore, it has to be this way and will be so. So let it be in the name of Jesus Christ, the Lord of life and death. In order that your electoral grace is not ignorant, however, regarding the reasons for my return, I'll explain to your electoral grace those which I consider most important. To begin with, I'm returning not out of contempt for the authority of the imperial majesty, or of your electoral grace, or of any other government. Human authority is not always to be obeyed, namely when it undertakes something against the commandments of God. Yet it should never be despised, but always honored. Christ did not justify Pilate's verdict, but he did not depose him or the emperor, nor did he show any contempt for him. The first reason for my return, I'm called by the whole congregation at Wittenberg in a letter filled with urgent begging and pleading. Since no one can deny that the present commotion has its origin in me, and since I must confess that I'm a humble servant of the congregation to which God has sent me, I had no way of refusing this call without rejecting Christian love and obedience. Many may consider this commotion something demonic. Many may criticize and condemn it. No doubt they don't consider this to be a reason for my return, and instead might consider it only just that Wittenberg and the work that was begun there should be left to perish. This does not excuse me, however, because God will not judge me according to the belief or disbelief of others, but according to my own conscience. I know that what I have to say and what I have begun does not originate in me, but in God. No death or persecution will teach me differently. It seems to me that one has to leave it this way. Second reason, on account of my absence, Satan has intruded into my fold at Wittenberg. The whole world shouts it abroad, and it certainly is true that Satan has injured some sheep, which I cannot heal with any writing. I have to deal with them personally, via mouth and ear. My conscience will no longer allow me to yield or procrastinate. Third reason, I'm rather afraid, and I worry that unfortunately I may be only too right, that there will be a real rebellion in the German territories by which God will punish the German nation. For we see that this gospel is excellently received by the common people, but they receive it in a fleshly sense. That is, they know that it's true, but do not want to use it correctly. Those who should calm such rebellion only aid it. They attempt to put out the light by force, not realizing that they are only embittering the hearts of men by this and stimulating them to revolt. And so those are the three big reasons that Luther is going to leave the Wartburg against the elector's wishes and proceed to straighten things out, as he says, personally, via mouth and ear. And so that's what these Invocavit sermons are all about. And we're going to watch him very patiently and gently sort of move these people to frame things in the right way. And so I would invite us to look at the very first of the Invocavit sermons, which I've printed out for you, beginning on page 9. So you heard his opening about the chief things. And so now he's going to go into detail about what those chief things are. So second paragraph, in the first place. So what are some of the chief things that a Christian must know to take into what? I mean, how has he framed this? Beginning with the first words. Death. Yeah. What does a Christian take into his death? He takes to his death these chief things. In the first place, we must know that we are the children of wrath, and all our works, intentions, and thoughts are nothing at all. Here we need a clear, strong text to bear out this point, such as the saying of St. Paul in Ephesians 2. Note this well, and though there are many such in the Bible, I do not wish to overwhelm you with many texts. We are all the children of wrath. And please do not start to say, I've built an altar, given a foundation for masses, etc. Second, God has sent us the only begotten Son that we may believe in him, so that whoever trusts in him shall be free from sin and a child of God. As John declares in his first chapter, to all who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. Here we should all be well versed in the Bible and ready to confront the devil with many passages. With respect to these 2 points, I do not feel that there has been anything wrong or lacking. They've been rightly preached to you, and I should be sorry if it were otherwise. Indeed, I'm well aware and dare say that you are more learned than I, and that there are not only 1, 2, 3, or 4, but perhaps 10 or more who have this awareness. All right, I want to pause there, kind of track with the sermon, and sort of stop and reflect on how Luther is carrying out this task of winning the people back. What has he done so far in the sermon? Imagine yourselves in that Wittenberg congregation, hearing this. Hearing from the guy that started it all. How do you feel at this point in the sermon?
Fine so far.
Fine so far? Yeah. Well, why fine so far? Well, what has he just got done saying about you?
Sinners in need of salvation. That's it.
Right?
But
not only that, but what about them and their knowledge of that?
They know it.
They know it.
And you're more, he says,
Yeah.
you're more learned than I am.
Yeah.
You know.
So he's giving them a compliment. He's saying, look, 2 out of 4 ain't bad. You get the fundamentals of the faith in a way that people a generation ago did not. It's been preached well to you, and you've heard it and taken it to heart yourselves, so that you could be entrusted to preach it just as well as I. What are you waiting for? The other shoe to drop. Yeah. So, third, we must also have love. And through love we must do to one another as God has done to us through faith. For without love, faith is nothing, as St. Paul says. If I had the tongues of angels and could speak of the highest things in faith and have not love, I'm nothing. And here, dear friends, have you not grievously failed? I see no signs of love among you. And I observe very well that you have not been grateful to God for his rich gifts and treasures. Here, let us beware lest Wittenberg become Capernaum. I notice that you have a great deal to say of the doctrine of faith and love which is preached to you, and this is no wonder, and ask and almost intone the lessons. And why should you not be able to repeat the doctrines and formulas? Dear friends, the kingdom of God, and we are that kingdom, does not consist in talk or words, but in activity and deeds and works and exercises. God does not want hearers and repeaters of words, but followers and doers. And this occurs in faith through love. For a faith without love is not enough. Rather, it's not faith at all, but a counterfeit of faith. Just as a face seen in a mirror is not a real face, but merely the reflection of a face. Fourth, we also need patience. For whoever has faith trusts in God and shows love to their neighbor, practicing it day by day, will undoubtedly suffer persecution. For the devil never sleeps, but constantly gives believers plenty of trouble. But patience works and produces hope, which freely yields itself to God and realizes itself in God. Thus faith, by much affliction and persecution, ever increases and is strengthened day by day. A heart thus blessed with virtues can never rest or restrain itself, but rather pours itself out again for the benefit and service of the brethren, just as God has done to it. All right. So where have they failed? What are points 3 and 4?
Showing love.
Love
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
and patience. Love and patience. And so now he's going to apply that to one particular issue in this sermon, which is the Mass. How does the call to love and to be patient with one another apply to the issue of policies concerning the Mass? And here, dear friends, believers must not insist upon their own rights, but must see what may be useful and helpful to their brothers and sisters. As Paul says, omnia mihi licent, sed no omnia expedient. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. For we're not all equally strong in faith, and some of you have even stronger faith than I. Therefore, we must not look upon ourselves or our strength or our prestige, but upon our neighbor. For God has said through Moses, I have borne and reared you as a mother does her child. What does a mother do to her child? First she gives it milk, then gruel, then eggs and soft food. Whereas if she turned about and gave it solid food, the child would never thrive. So we should also deal with our brothers and sisters, have patience with them for a time, have patience with their weakness, and help them bear it. We should also give them milk food too, as was done with us, until they too grow strong. In this way we don't travel heavenward alone, but bring those brothers and sisters who are not yet our friends with us. If all mothers were to abandon their children, where would we have been? Dear friend, if you have suckled long enough, do not at once cut off the breast, but let your neighbor be suckled as you were. If I had been here, I would not have gone so far as you have. The cause is good, but there's been too much haste. For there are still brothers and sisters on the other side who belong to us and must still be one. What's he saying? He's making a very important distinction here, isn't he? I mean, this applies in general to all the issues. But we're going to see him apply it to one in particular in a second. But what's he saying about the changes themselves? Communion in both kinds. Getting rid of the liturgy that turns the Lord's Supper into a sacrifice we're making to God. What's Luther's position on those things?
Same as theirs.
Same as theirs. He wants, there should be communion in both kinds. That's not the way God set it up. That's not Jesus' institution. And it's blasphemy. I mean, Luther is going to say, we did this 3 years ago when we covered those 3 treatises that got Luther the deepest trouble that led to the Diet of Worms, but he's going to say that the greatest abomination in the Roman Catholic system is the Mass. Is the treating of Christ's body and blood as though it needs to be re-sacrificed again and again and again. We turn it into a work instead of the gift. We know where Luther stands on that. And yet what? Why don't we just immediately make it the way Luther says it should be?
The people don't know why.
People don't know why. What has to take place first?
Education.
Yeah, teaching, education. Let's go to the Word and let's all be convinced individually of this and then make the changes together. Let me illustrate, he says. The sun has two properties, light and heat. No king has power enough to bend or guide the light of the sun. It remains fixed in its place. But the heat may be turned and guided, even as it always still comes from the sun. Thus faith must always remain pure and immovable in our hearts, never wavering. But love bends and turns so that our neighbor may grasp and follow it. There are some who can run, others must walk, still others can hardly creep. Therefore we must not look upon our own abilities, but upon our neighbor's powers, so that those who are weak in faith and attempt to follow the strong may not be snatched up by the devil. Therefore, dear friends, follow me. I've never been a destroyer. I was also the first whom God set to this task. I cannot run away, but will remain as long as God allows. I was also the first one to whom God revealed that his word should be preached to you. I'm also sure that you have the clear word of God. Let us therefore act with fear and humility, casting ourselves at one another's feet, reaching out our hands to one another and helping each other. I'll do my part, which is no more than my duty, to love you even as I love my own soul. For here we battle not against popes, bishops, or anyone else, but against the devil. And do you imagine he's asleep? He sleeps not, but sees the true light rising. And to keep it from shining into his eyes, he would like to make a flank attack. And he'll succeed if we're not on our guard. I know him well, and I hope too that with the help of God I am his master. But if we yield him but an inch, we must soon look to it how we may be rid of him. Therefore all those who have erred, who have helped and consented to abolish the Mass, not that it was not a good thing, but that it was not done in an orderly way. You say it was right according to the Scriptures. I agree. But what becomes of order? For it was done in wantonness, with no regard for proper order, and with offense to your neighbor. If beforehand you had called upon God in earnest prayer, and had obtained the aid of the authorities, one could be certain that it had come from God. I too would have taken steps toward the same end, if it had been a good thing to do. And if the Mass were not so evil a thing, I would introduce it again. For I cannot defend your action as I have just said. To the papists and blockheads I could defend it. For I could say, how do you know whether it was done with good or bad intention, since the work in itself was really a good work? But I would not know what to assert before the devil. For if on their deathbeds the devil reminds those who began this affair of texts like these, every plant which my Father has not planted will be rooted up. Or I have not sent them, yet they ran. How will they be able to withstand? Now, do you follow the argument he's making there? You know, I love this about this particular sermon. See, he says, look, if the outsider is going to criticize you, I'll defend you before the outsider. I'll say, who are you to judge the motives of these guys in Wittenberg who made all these changes? Okay? But the question is, what are you going to say to the devil when he accuses you of doing this not out of love of God, not because you were sure it was the right thing to do, but because you just wanted to do it? You see, I mean, it's. I'll go into this a little bit more next week. But one of the amazing things is, I mean, Luther is doing this kind of double thing at this very moment. Because he's telling the people themselves, slow down. Let's study the Word together and be convinced and persuaded that this is the right thing to do before we make this change and impose it on people. But meanwhile, we know he's writing letters to the electors saying, get rid of the Mass already. I mean, he's being very urgent behind the scenes about this stuff. But with the people, his people, he's their preacher. See, that's a big deal. As he said it already, he's going to say it at some point in the sermon, how offended he was that you did all this. You never wrote me once. I'm your pastor. Meaning he's not calling himself a pastor. He's the appointed preacher for this church. And they never once sort of, well, what do you think? Should we do this now? Should we wait? Yeah. All right. So, for if on their deathbeds the devil reminds those who began this affair. We did that. Okay. Skip to the next paragraph. Here it is. I was not so far away. In the very last sentence of the previous paragraph. I was willing to accept you as you were willing to accept me. And besides, you could have consulted me about the matter. I wasn't so far away that you couldn't reach me with a letter. Whereas not the slightest communication was sent to me. If you're going to begin something and make me responsible for it, and see, we all know that's happening. We heard the report saying a bunch of Martinians did this. So everything going on in Wittenberg is being pinned on Luther, who isn't authorizing any of it. I will not do it. Here one can see that you do not have the Spirit, even though you do have a deep knowledge of the Scriptures. Take note of these two things, and this distinction will run through all the other sermons. Must and free. The must is that which necessity requires, and which must ever be unyielding. As, for instance, the faith, which I shall never permit anyone to take away from me, but must always keep in my heart and freely confess before everyone. But free is that in which I have choice, and may use or not, yet in such a way that it profit my neighbor and not me. Now do not make a must out of what's free, as you have done, so that you may not be called to account for those who were led astray by your loveless exercise of liberty. For if you entice people to eat meat on Fridays, and they become troubled by it on their deathbed, thinking, woe is me, for I've eaten meat and I'm lost, until they can no longer stand it, then God will call you to account for that soul. I too would like to begin many things in which but few would follow me. But what's the use? For I know that when the conflicts come, those who have begun such things will not be able to persevere and will be the first to retreat. How would it be if I brought the crowds to the point of attack, and then if I, who had been the first to exhort others, would then flee death rather than steadfastly face it? How the poor people would be deceived. Let us therefore feed others also with the milk which we received, until they too become strong in faith. For there are many who are otherwise in accord with us, and who would also gladly accept this thing, but they don't yet fully understand it. These we drive away. And see, again, you can see the concern. It's a proper concern, because what's actually happening? People are actually, they're kind of watching this Reformation thing develop. And what so far are the fruits of this Reformation thing? Vandalism, violence, forcing people these, in their world, radical changes to the worship practice and the life of the church. And they're saying, well, this obviously is not of God, this Reformation thing. And we have letters of people saying exactly that, who had been on Luther's side pre-Worms, and when this stuff happens, and some other violence and unrest that's going to happen in the next few years, they say, I'm out. It's kind of like Gamaliel, right? In sticking up for Peter and John and saying, whoa, before we do what we did to Jesus with these guys, look, let's face it, if it's of God, it will prosper. But if it isn't of God, it will die on its own. So we don't have to go to extra lengths to make examples of these two guys. But if we're wrong and this is of God and it prospers, oh man, were we in trouble. See, that's what Gamaliel says. And so people are taking kind of that same attitude towards this new thing that Luther has started. And how is this helping? That you've got people interrupting the Mass and stealing the priest's book and tearing down the stained, the crucifixes and smashing the stained glass. So if we do not earnestly pray to God and act rightly in this matter, it looks to me as if all the complaints that we've heaped upon the papists will fall upon us. Therefore I could no longer remain away, but was compelled to come and say these things to you. That's enough about the Mass. Tomorrow we'll speak about images.
Well, next Wednesday, whichever.
That's right. In this case, next Wednesday. But yeah, isn't that wonderful? and we're going to get into images. We're going to get into communion of both kinds. We're going to get into all the dietary rules that the Roman Catholic Church had imposed, the no meat on Friday kind of stuff. But you get what he's doing here. He's saying it's one thing, even with something that he himself is convinced of the rightness of, doesn't mean we immediately go to that without first reading and studying the Scriptures together. I mean, it's a wonderful model of pastoral care. So, any questions, comments, criticisms? Bev?
Next week, could you have like 10 more copies?
Yeah,
just for the rest
that's
of us.
right. You couldn't even, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's fine.
Sorry,
but
keep it.
maybe
I have-
have some-
Sorry, I hope that wasn't too hard for those of you who didn't have a copy to follow along with. So, yeah, Kathy.
Has that.
Did
Do you want me
the
to email
Catholic
you a
Church
copy?
make any changes from
I'll
that
send it
point
to you.
on? With because it used to be all in Latin, and now, they do have Bible studies.
Right.
And have they made changes
Yeah.
because of some of this?
So, there was a hardening, really, an entrenchment with the Council of Trent in response to the Lutheran Reformation. And so they stood their ground. They doubled down on a lot of these things that Luther criticized them for. And so changes more in the direction of Protestantism really wouldn't come until the 20th century. And things like Vatican II is going to open the door for more contemporary language, masses, and things like that. I'm trying to think of things. I mean, the indulgence stuff, they did come back. They retreated a little bit. I mean, you can still get a plenary indulgence. I mean, those haven't gone away. There was one for the year 2000. I think if you quit smoking, you got a plenary indulgence in the year 2000.
What does that do if you're an adult? What will that...
Well, it would mean that you get to spend less time in purgatory. Or you can buy it for someone else and get less, get them to heaven quicker, so they're not in purgatory longer. Yeah.
So they still do
But that system is still there. It's still there. But they certainly...
And purgatory's still there too.
Purgatory is still still part of the system, but that they certainly saw the scandal of sort of preying on the poorest in the church to get money to build this monstrosity, St. Peter's. And Tetzel ends up on the outs. Tetzel went too far. Even the Roman Catholic Church ended up agreeing, but yeah, a lot of these things just don't change for a long time. I'm fairly certain. Well, I know because I have Roman Catholic friends that there's freedom with respect to how one receives the elements in the Lord's Supper. But I've got Roman Catholic friends that are very upset about that. There shouldn't be freedom. The only right way to do it is to have it directly put on your tongue. That kind of thing. So that tells me that this is something fairly recent, the freedom to have the elements distributed in a different way.
They still don't have both kinds.
Oh, I think most parishes do. Yeah, they do have them both. Now, you will find places that still do only one. That's right. Only the priest drinks from the chalice.
And
Yeah.
he has to finish the wine. I know we were at a Catholic funeral just this past week. It's been a long time since I've been at a Catholic
Yeah,
church.
yeah.
I was reminded, they had communion at the funeral.
Right.
And then the priest drank all the wine when it was done. And I can't remember why they have to drink all the wine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but was it
Because it's fun.
distributed though? Did other were
Yes.
before that?
Yeah, it was all
Yeah,
common
and that's
for
just
everybody.
okay. Now what do? We have extra, and so that's one way. I mean that's fine.
You have a lot of masses, though. Boy, you're...
That's right. Oh, see, another issue that will come up, just a heads up, is, Karlstadt is going to eliminate having to come to confession before receiving communion. And so that's a huge, that has been the rule for centuries in the Roman Catholic Church. And for Karlstadt just to up and say, hey, come on up. Unless people are persuaded, unless you explain to them why that's okay, then people aren't going to be doing it in the confidence that it's the right thing to do. And that's a terrible burden on that conscience, like Luther is saying. You know, the devil's going to bring all this stuff up. You didn't confess your sins before you received communion. Right? Whether that's right or wrong, they've been taught that it's wrong forever. And so you don't just correct that way of thinking overnight. See? But I bring that up because registration or confessing ahead of time at least gets you, it's like RSVPing. And so you can better manage the resources of the wine and the bread that way. And since that's discontinued, you're going to end up with surplus. Yeah.
Yes, but you know, so many of the Catholic rules that they had, it's Catholics now, a lot of them that I know just pick and choose what they want to do.
Yeah, it's. I remember a priest participating in a symposium at a seminary when I was there, and one of the Lutheran speakers made a joke about how we in our Protestant churches have to deal with church shopping in a way that I guess you Roman Catholics don't. And the priest, when he got to the podium, says, "Oh, that's a problem for us too."
Oh, it is, because if one priest says one thing and they don't like
yeah,
it,
exactly. You have
exactly right.
more conservative and less
Right.
conservative. Yeah. A more traditional or Latin Mass church parish versus a vernacular parish. Yeah.
I think it happens
Well,
here.
it seems like so many people couldn't read back then that they had to take their word for it no matter what.
Yes,
And
there
now
is
you
that.
can read and you can
That's
read the
right.
Bible and you can question more.
Yes, yeah, there is that, yeah. But I hope, because I really do, in that third session, I want to apply some of the lessons of this experience, because, spoiler alert, the sermons are effective. They really do have the intended effect. And we have all these wonderful accounts of how order's been brought back to Wittenberg. And things are going to slow. Now, they're going to make all of these changes eventually. Most of them, let's say. We'll see that. But they're now going to do it in an orderly way, and in a way that's grounded in individual consciences being persuaded by God's Word, and not just because Karlstadt said so, or because Willing said so, or because the Wittenberg Ordinance mandated it. See? That kind of thing. But then to talk about issues of must versus free in our own life as a church. Yeah. Gene.
Well, you all probably haven't heard it, but maybe you have and just forgot it. The current Pope has said it is no longer appropriate for priests to be unmarried. And that's because he inherited the priesthood, the popehood, when there were so many priests who were having sex with the altar boys.
Right.
And he had to clean up all of that
Well,
mess. And now he says, no.
But if
God put man and woman together for a purpose, and that's what we
one
do
of
in
the,
our church.
if not the next one, the third sermon is about vows, and it's a very, again, a very nuanced sermon, because we know where Luther stands. Luther wants to recover marriage as an institution by God, favored, honored by God, and that it had been treated kind of as a cop-out in the Middle Ages, as this is for those of you who aren't spiritual enough to handle celibacy. And so we know where Luther stands on this. And at the same time, he's not going to say, all you monks have to get married now.
Yeah.
You see? And so must versus free. Must versus free. So, all right. Well, I hope we're off to a good start.
Very good.